Welcome to the 5th episode in a Legendarium series about the Wars of the Roses. In this installment, The Deaths of Kings, we will talk about how King Edward IV wiped out his enemies and led England into a time of peace and prosperity, only for everything to be undone by an unexpected death. With Warwick the Kingmaker killed in the aftermath of the Battle of Barnet, and King Henry's only son Edward of Westminster killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury, both in 1471, King Edward IV took the throne for a second time. In the past, he showed clemency to rebels. However, to make certain he stayed on the throne this time, he hunted down the important Lancastrians. Edward IV almost certainly ordered the murder of former King Henry VI in the Tower of London on May 21st, 1471. Men walked into the king's chamber and smashed in his skull with a blunt weapon. Of course, King Edward IV insisted that the man he overthrew had died of displeasure and melancholy. He even put Henry's body on display to quiet any doubts, with Henry's head wounds carefully covered. Queen Margaret, his most dangerous enemy, remained a prisoner until 1476, when he returned her to France. George, Duke of Clarence, already forgiven twice for rebellion, became implicated in a plot when an Oxford astronomer confessed, likely under threat of torture, that George asked him to use the black arts to imagine the king's death. Possibly at his own request, George's executioners drowned him in a barrel of Malmsey wine within the Tower of London. With no enemies left, King Edward IV could turn his attention to his own dynasty, and in 1471 he had his firstborn son, Prince Edward. According to his father's instructions, Prince Edward would have a balanced education, with enough time to play and enjoy his dogs and horses. King Edward IV also instructed that his son would eat and sleep well, and his household would be free of swearers, brawlers, backbiters, common hazarders, adulterers, and words of ribaldry. He would have a second son named Richard in Shrewsbury during 1473. The young Richard would become Duke of York, starting a tradition of the monarch's second son receiving the title Duke of York. And at the age of 4, King Edward contracted his younger son to marry the 5-year-old Anne de Mowbray. Later, young Richard would become Duke of Norfolk as well. England enjoyed a long period of peace and prosperity after the Wars of the Roses. King Edward IV used that peace well. He supported England's involvement in international trade, becoming personally involved in some business ventures. With England home to more than 8 million sheep, Edward became especially interested in the wool trade with Burgundy. The English economy recovered and the treasury became solvent for the first time in generations. Even his only major military adventure, leading an army of 12,000 men into France, likely had a commercial goal in mind. Though Edward IV failed to win over any major French nobles to his cause, King Louis XI of France happily paid for Edward to remove his army and granted new trade concessions to England. This new wealth went into literature, with England's first printed books appearing. King Edward himself built the first royal library, home to 40 manuscripts that included Caesar's book on Gaul. Wealth also went into grand architecture and lavish tournaments. These events could go on for days and included stalls with refreshments, horse sellers, clothing vendors, dramatic performances with musicians and acrobats, along with several banquets over the course of the tournament. Knights wore elaborate suits of armor with iron plate fashioned to resemble the ruffles and doublets coming into fashion. Yet King Edward's romantic life would have far greater consequences for his dynasty. Despite his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, he publicly declared his enjoyment of 3 mistresses, whom he called the merriest, wiliest, and holiest harlots of England. Indeed, he often tantalized women with the prospect of becoming queen to get into their bedchambers, and then left them without keeping his promise. Along with 10 children he had with Queen Elizabeth Woodville, Edward fathered 5 illegitimate children with various mothers. Only one, Arthur Plantagenet, would be legitimized and become the first Viscount Lisle. King Edward IV also began an affair with a woman named Jane Shore in 1476 after his return from France. This affair lasted for almost 7 years until the king's death in 1483. It is said that Shore didn't use her position as chief mistress to enrich herself, but rather spread the riches to those who had been thrown out of the king's good graces. Unfortunately, peace and plenty may have conquered King Edward. Renowned for his athleticism and military prowess as a young man, he became increasingly overweight and sickly after too many royal banquets and too many mistresses. Sometime in early 1483, King Edward fell ill with either pneumonia or typhoid fever. Edward remained strong enough to amend his will, where he left his surviving brother Richard of Gloucester, the guardian of his sons 12-year-old Edward V and 9-year-old Richard the Younger. Yet the prospect of another child king, with the disastrous reign of Henry VI still in living memory, deeply unsettled England's ruling class. Duke Richard of Gloucester seemed the better candidate for the throne. He ran the north of England during his brother's reign with the title Governor of the North. Parliament had even thanked him for his governorship, granted him Cumberland as County Palatine, and licensed his plans for war against Scotland. If not for his sudden elevation to the throne, the Scottish Wars would have surely become Richard of Gloucester's main pursuit in life. Unfortunately, the many affairs of King Edward IV compromised his heirs and opened a door to Richard of Gloucester. Edward IV had contracted to marry Lady Eleanor Butler before he married Elizabeth Woodville, and in theory, this made his marriage to Elizabeth illegitimate, their 2 sons bastards, and potentially opened the door for Uncle Richard to take the throne. When news of Edward's death reached Richard of Gloucester a few days later, he rushed to meet his nephew on the return journey and escort him personally to Westminster so he could be crowned. On April 29th, Richard met the royal entourage and dined with them. At first, it looked as if Richard would be loyal to the dynasty. Instead, on the following morning, Duke Richard arrested the royal escorts Earl Rivers and Lord Richard Grey and sent them north. Both would later be executed. Richard of Gloucester then used his brother's old contract with Lady Butler to declare his nephews illegitimate. Few in Parliament protested, as they feared the Woodville family, mere commoners, would be running the kingdom under another child king. Prince Edward went into the Tower of London, supposedly for his own protection. Meanwhile, his mother Elizabeth and younger brother Richard sought sanctuary. The 12-year-old peace of England appeared to be sundering. Will the wars resume? We will find out in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this installment of The Legendarium. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.